Hi, my name is Troy Hubble from Your Dyslexia Expert. Wearing my Oregon Trail shirt today. My wife was kindly enough to make this for me. It's from the really old video game Oregon Trail. It's a reference to it at least, and it says, just or never ford the river, just don't do it. If you, like me, played that game as a kid, you know that whenever you reach a river, you can try to just ford across it, which means drive your wagon across it, and it's never a good idea. Just as it's never a good idea to try to ford the river with dyslexia. Just keep going and see what happens. We want to make sure that students with dyslexia get the instruction they need. And with that said, I'm sure you're not here to listen to me nerd out about old video games, but to hear about and learn about dyslexia. So let's get started. Today, we're talking about the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect is a term that you can Google and you can see sort of the history of it. But essentially, what the Matthew effect refers to is the fact that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And in the context of reading and academics, what that means is when students start with a higher level of skill and competency, they grow faster. And if students start with a lower level of skill and competency, they grow slower. This means that the students who start ahead continue to get farther and farther and farther ahead. And the students who start behind continue to fall farther and farther and farther behind until what began as a relatively small deficit affects them across the board in their academics. The Matthew effect is not inevitable. There's a lot that we can do to prevent this from happening. That being said, this is what happens when we don't provide intervention to students who have dyslexia. So, if you can imagine at the start of kindergarten, okay, we have two students. And I drew a line representing each of the students. This red line represents a student who does not have dyslexia, a typical student. I don't really like that word because if there's such a thing as a typical person, I've never met one. This green line represents a student who has dyslexia. So you can see they both come in with a pretty decent set of skills. Now, these can vary, sometimes with a more serious presentation of dyslexia or some other underlying disabilities. This line might come in a little bit shorter. And sometimes, if this student has more life experience, more vocabulary, and things like that, this line might come in a little bit longer. But in general, the gap at the start of kindergarten is not very big. It is very far from insurmountable. But here's what happens. What I did for this slide, for the start of first grade, is I used an analogy. I doubled the size of the red line of the typical student, and I doubled the size of the green line, the student with dyslexia. And look what happened. What began as a relatively small gap has also grown substantially bigger. And I'm trying to double these by sight, so forgive me if they're not perfectly doubled. But you'll get the point. Because there was more of this line to grow, that means this line grew more. And because there was less of this line to grow, that means this line grew less. What that means is, in terms of this analogy, because this student began with more skills, there were more skills to expand, and so they were able to expand their skills faster. Because this student began with fewer skills, although they've made progress, their progress was slower than the student with more skills because they had fewer skills to apply towards that progress. If we then double that again, this would be the start of second grade. Now note, the gap has doubled again. And we continue on to third grade and to fourth grade. And I want you to assume at this point that this line goes off the screen. And what happens when we do nothing is that students with dyslexia continue to grow more slowly than students without dyslexia because they have fewer skills to apply to their growth. In real world terms, what this means is as they go up through first grade, second grade, and third grade, they are able to read fewer words, and so they're able to access fewer vocabulary words and less complex language. They are also able to get less practice in proficient decoding because they don't know how to do it. The student, meanwhile, who came in without dyslexia is getting a lot of practice reading books and a lot of practice accessing vocabulary. And because they have decoding skills, they're able to practice those skills and make them more proficient. As this gap continues to grow, the student who does not have dyslexia will wind up with a dramatically larger vocabulary. It turns out we get most of our vocabulary from accessing text. This student will also wind up with a dramatically larger access and understanding of complex language. This will really, really help with comprehension, with math, and with numerous other things. Whereas our student with dyslexia can't access enough text to gain that and continues to struggle to decode. This will compound and compound and compound and compound until the student with dyslexia reaches a point where catching them up is very difficult and increasingly unlikely. So what do we do? First, we know a couple of different things. If we provide intervention early, the gap tends not to get so big. This is not a giant gap to make up. All that is happening with the majority of our kids with dyslexia is that they're not able to hear and manipulate the spoken sounds of language as well as other students. When we catch this early and provide a good intervention, it never develops beyond that gap because we close the gap and they continue to access text and practice right alongside the other students. Unfortunately, many schools are not the best at this, and special education law in the United States is almost designed to exacerbate this problem because in special education law, we cannot provide special education services until the gap is larger than this, which means that schools are at the mercy of their funding, whether they have interventionists, and whether those interventionists have access to the training and resources they need to provide this intervention. Very often what happens is we tend to intervene here or here when we have a much larger gap to deal with. And that is because this is when the gap has reached a level where schools oftentimes will start talking with families about an IEP, and families will really start to notice that something different is happening with their child than is happening with some of the other children in their class. Here's what you do. While your child is receiving intervention, that intervention is going to teach them how to sound out words, how to decode, how to spell. We want to make sure that they are still accessing as much language, as much text, and as much complicated vocabulary as possible. Remember, dyslexia only impacts our ability to sound out words for reading and spelling. When you read to a child, they can access all of those features of the text just as well as any of the other children, assuming there aren't any other underlying comprehension difficulties going on. The way that we stop the Matthew effect, or if it's started, stop it from growing any bigger and actually start to close this gap, is we make sure that our students are accessing all of the content of other students through orally presented text and material, and that at the same time, we're providing a robust, consistent intervention to fill in some of those gaps so that they can learn to decode and access that kind of vocabulary and text structure and all of those other things on their own. The Matthew effect is not inevitable. It's the result of a system that is not designed well to empower parents or educators in terms of how to help their kids. If you have a student with dyslexia, the two things that I cannot recommend enough are, number one, start reading to them. Talk to the school, get their math tests read to them. They should not have to be barred out of math, be barred out of science, be barred out of social studies because they can't read, when we can read to them. We also have assistive technology that can help with writing, that can help with spelling, that can help with oral presentation on their own so they don't need an adult. We can give them access to all of these features that would contribute to the Matthew effect so that it doesn't have a chance to grow. So that would be step number one. And one way that I've seen that work really well is pick a chapter book, and it can be a chapter book that you liked when you were a kid. And every night at bedtime, just read one chapter with your kid and talk about it. It should be fun, it should be a bonding experience, it should be nice. The other thing is, whether it's through the school, whether it's through a professional like me, or whether it's through action that you take to provide an intervention for your own child, please provide an intervention, because the faster we get students to coding, the more we can minimize any potential Matthew effect's chance to grow. We do not want our students' gaps to get bigger. We want them to get smaller. And that means that we have to close that decoding gap. But in the meantime, we can stop that gap from forming by providing access to all of the other parts of education during their day. If you have any questions or any literacy concepts that you want explained, please comment in this video below. If you want me to make a video about another aspect of literacy, another question you have, or anything like that, please also comment below or reach out on my website, and I'm happy to make a video explaining that to you. Last, if you know somebody who is struggling, please reach out to me on my website. I'm here to help, and we can stop this gap before it has the chance to grow any bigger. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I will talk to you guys the next time.